Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the second of our two-part series about the 1981 murder of Christine Schultz and the controversial conviction of Laurie Bambi Bembenek. We released part 1 last week, which outlined some of the most important facts of the case, and if you haven't heard that episode yet, I suggest you go back and listen to it since I shared a lot of information which will be relevant to what we're discussing today. As a brief recap, the murder of 30-year-old Christine Schultz took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin during the early morning hours of May the 28th, 1981, as she was shot to death during a home invasion by a masked intruder who was seen by Christine's 2 young sons. Christine's ex-husband, Fred Schultz, was a veteran Milwaukee police detective who quickly got remarried to a 22-year-old woman named Laurie Bembenek, who had been given the nickname Bambi even though she despised it. Laurie had attempted to become a police officer herself, but was fired shortly after graduating from the academy and responded by filing a discrimination claim against the city of Milwaukee, as she alleged that the police department was rampant with corruption and created a hostile working environment for female and minority officers. Nearly 1 month after Christine's murder, Laurie would be arrested and charged with the crime after ballistics tests supposedly showed that an off-duty .38 caliber revolver Fred kept at their apartment was the murder weapon. Since Laurie appeared to be the only one with access to the revolver during the time period of the murder and did not have a verifiable alibi, the authorities believed that she was the masked intruder who killed Christine, even though one of Christine's sons was certain the perpetrator was a man. Laurie was found guilty at trial and received a sentence of life imprisonment, but she maintained that she was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy from the Milwaukee PD, who fabricated most of the evidence against her and framed her for the crime. And since Fred Schultz divorced Laurie shortly after she went to prison, she came to believe that he was involved in Christine's murder and may have hired someone to commit the crime. While she was incarcerated, Laurie became romantically involved with a man named Nick Gugliotto and planned to marry him, but after her legal appeals were turned down, Laurie convinced Nick to help her break out of prison on July the 25th, 1990. When we left off at the end of part 1 last week, Laurie and Nick had become 2 of the most wanted fugitives in the United States, but thanks to the massive publicity surrounding the case, Laurie had a slew of supporters who were convinced that she had been wrongly convicted and were rooting for her to evade the authorities. So on this episode, I'm going to tell you how the rest of this story turned out before I provide my theories and analysis, and then I'll share my opinion about whether Laurie Bembenek was actually guilty of this crime or if she was an innocent woman who wound up being railroaded in a huge way. So without any further ado, let us now present part 2 of our series about the murder of Christine Schultz. So at the end of our last episode, I mentioned how even though Laurie Bambi Bembenek had become a wanted fugitive, a number of people believed she was innocent and considered her to be some sort of folk hero, as they started selling t-shirts and bumper stickers featuring the slogan, "Run Bambi Run." 3 days after Laurie's escape from prison, Nick's abandoned truck was discovered in the parking lot of a department store just outside Milwaukee, but the couple could not be found anywhere. Laurie and Nick always remained very secretive about the exact details of how they pulled off their escape, but it would turn out that they used an Oldsmobile Cutlass as transportation to flee the state. It's been alleged that Laurie's parents, Joe and Virginia Bembenek, provided the vehicle to Nick, though whether or not they knew he was going to use it to break Laurie out of prison has always been up for debate. Joe and Virginia later appeared as guests on an episode of the Geraldo Rivera Show to discuss their daughter's case, and Fred Schultz and Laurie's original trial attorney, Donald Eisenberg, both made appearances via satellite. When Laurie was first arrested and went on trial for Christine Schultz's murder, Fred continued to support her and insist that she was innocent, but shortly after Laurie went to prison, Fred decided to divorce her and started telling the press that he now believed she was guilty. In the years following the trial, Donald Eisenberg had since been disbarred, but during his appearance on Geraldo, he also expressed his personal opinion that Laurie committed the crime. Of course, when Laurie got new defense attorneys, one of their biggest arguments when they appealed Laurie's conviction was that there was a major conflict of interest when Eisenberg represented her at the trial. Fred had helped pay Eisenberg's legal fees and was heavily involved in preparing Laurie's defense, but his influence may have prevented Eisenberg from presenting evidence which showed that Fred was a more compelling alternate suspect in Christine's murder. Anyway, Laurie and Nick managed to elude the authorities for nearly 3 months, but given the high-profile nature of their case, it was inevitable that they would be profiled as fugitives on an episode of the popular true crime TV show America's Most Wanted. Well, it wasn't long before law enforcement received a tip from a viewer who had watched the episode and recognized Laurie and Nick as a couple who were now residing in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, located nearly 600 miles north of Milwaukee. It turned out that prior to the escape, Nick had gone to a Milwaukee cemetery and taken the names Anthony Gazzana and Jennifer Vogel from the tombstones of some deceased infants and acquired some reissued copies of their birth certificates under those names. Since crossing the border from the United States into Canada did not require a passport back in 1990, Nick and Laurie were able to drive into Ontario by using these birth certificates as identification. After they arrived at Thunder Bay, they moved into a rented basement apartment and started new lives as a married couple named Anthony and Jennifer Gazzana, with Nick getting a job as a short-order cook and Laurie finding work as a waitress and fitness instructor. But on October the 17th, shortly after they were recognized on America's Most Wanted, Nick and Laurie were both arrested by the Thunder Bay Police Service and held at the local jail. Now, Nick would eventually be deported back to the United States, and in October of 1991, he pled guilty to his role in Laurie's escape and received a 1-year sentence in the Fond du Lac County Jail, and he was ordered to pay extradition costs of $2,500. Laurie and Nick attempted to correspond with each other and remain in touch, but Nick eventually stopped answering her letters. Once he was released from jail, Nick showed no hesitation about capitalizing on his fame from the whole situation, as he appeared on a number of TV shows and later went on to publish a book about his story titled You Never Have to Remember the Truth, the Nick Guglielmo Story. Some of Nick's public comments rubbed Laurie the wrong way, such as when he made an appearance on the TV show A Current Affair and stated, quote, "I could only imagine what it would be like to be with a woman that hasn't had sex for 8.5 years. Come on, it's every man's dream," end quote. Well, Laurie's legal situation was a lot more complicated, as she eventually retained the services of a couple of Canadian attorneys who decided to help her apply for refugee status, as they alleged that she had been persecuted by a conspiracy between the Milwaukee Police Department and the judicial system in Wisconsin. Laurie would be represented by a Toronto-based attorney named Frank Morocco, who was often referred to as the quote-unquote F. Lee Bailey of Canada, which is only appropriate, given that I recently released a series of episodes where I discussed F. Lee Bailey's representation of Sam Shepard when he was convicted of the 1954 murder of his wife, Marilyn Reese Shepard. Morocco wrote a 91-page brief outlining the reasons why Laurie should not be returned to the United States, and she was transferred from Thunder Bay to the Metro West Detention Center in Toronto, where she would remain for over a year while Canadian immigration officials figured out what to do. A credible basis hearing was scheduled to take place in front of a Canadian tribunal in order to determine if Laurie should be allowed to remain in the country, and after Laurie agreed to take a polygraph which was administered by the Department of National Defense, she wound up passing. At the request of her attorneys, Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge William Hayes had agreed to launch a John Doe investigation, which is a legal proceeding in the state of Wisconsin that is similar to a grand jury investigation, but the difference is that it is overseen by a judge rather than a jury. Laurie's defense team would be allowed to subpoena any witnesses they wanted, and the details of their testimony would be kept secret from the public. I mentioned in our last episode that while Laurie was incarcerated in Wisconsin, a private investigator named Ira Robbins agreed to assist with her case, and he wound up uncovering evidence which seemed to support Laurie's innocence and the idea that she was the victim of an elaborate frame-up job. One of the key pieces of evidence at the original trial was a reddish-brown wig which had been found in the drain pipes of an apartment belonging to a woman named Sharon Niswonger. Since Christine's killer had worn a wig matching that description, and Laurie's apartment was adjacent to Niswonger's place and shared the same drainage, the implication seemed to be that Laurie had flushed the wig down the toilet following the crime. However, during Laurie's time on the run, Ira Robbins spoke to Niswonger, and she shared an odd story about Laurie's former friend Judy Zess, who had briefly been roommates with Laurie and Fred at their apartment and testified her as a prosecution witness at the trial. Niswonger claimed that a few weeks after Christine's murder took place, but before Laurie was arrested, Judy had stopped by her apartment while carrying a gym bag and asked Niswonger if she would like to come work out with her. Since Niswonger barely knew Judy, she found this to be unusual, but even though she declined her invitation, Judy asked if she could use her bathroom to change into her gym clothes. Niswonger agreed to this, but the next time her bathroom was used, the toilet was discovered to be clogged, and after Niswonger called a plumber to her apartment, he discovered the wig in the drain pipes. While this was never conclusively proven, the whole situation seemed to suggest that Judy may have been carrying the wig in her gym bag and flushed it down Niswonger's toilet in an attempt to frame Laurie. During the time period of Christine's murder, Fred seemed to have a solid alibi, as both he and his partner, Michael Durfee, were on duty and claimed they were investigating a burglary together. However, Ira Robbins learned that 2 other Milwaukee police officers had actually handled this particular burglary, as Fred and Durfee were seen drinking at various bars throughout their shift. This story was backed up by George Marks, the owner of a bar called George's Pub and Grub, who had spent time drinking with the 2 cops. Marks told Robbins that Fred disappeared for a short time at around 2 a.m. and just assumed he was using the bathroom, but this technically meant that Fred's whereabouts could not be accounted for during the approximate time frame when Christine was killed. In addition, Marks confirmed that he had personally introduced Fred to a suspect named Frederick Hornberger, who may have been Christine's real killer, but we'll get back to him momentarily. Robbins also learned that following the murders, a photo album had been collected as evidence from Christine's residence. After the Milwaukee PD was ordered to turn over the album to Laurie's defense team, Robbins learned that fingerprints belonging to Fred and the crime's lead investigator, Carl Rusitti, had been found on it. But while some other prints were apparently collected from the album following the murder, they had seemingly gone missing without explanation. In our last episode, I made mention of an infamous police picnic which took place in a public park, where a number of officers, including Fred, danced naked on the picnic tables in front of a large crowd of people, which included children. Some of the nude photos from this picnic were in the album, but it appeared that other photos had been removed. Robbins speculated that Christine's killer could have taken the photos during the home invasion, but the album was never turned over to Laurie's defense attorney, Donald Eisenberg, prior to the trial. It also turned out that in November of 1981, a few months before the trial began, a pair of Milwaukee police detectives had approached Milwaukee County District Attorney E. Michael McCann because they wanted to charge Fred with various offenses, including perjury. McCann declined to file charges and supposedly told the detectives, quote, "Do you want Bembenek or do you want Schultz?" End quote. Once again, this information was never turned over to Laurie's defense at her trial and raised more questions about a possible conflict of interest involving Fred and Eisenberg. Christine's autopsy had been performed by Dr. Elaine Samuels, the Milwaukee County Assistant Medical Examiner, who always believed that some evidence tampering might have taken place. As you recall, a blonde hair was found on the bandana used to gag Christine, which was consistent with Laurie's hair, but Dr. Samuels always insisted that she never found any blonde hairs when she performed the autopsy. Of course, there was always controversy over the fact that ballistics tests supposedly showed that Fred's off-duty .38 caliber revolver was the murder weapon, as Fred and Michael Durfee had collected the revolver from the apartment only a few hours after Christine's murder, and after checking the gun, Durfee initially said that it had dust on it and had not been fired or handled in quite some time. Well, Dr. Samuels now revealed that when she removed the bullet from Christine's body, she wrote the victim's initials, CJS, on it. However, when the bullet was presented as evidence at trial, it now had additional initials which were not in Samuels' handwriting and had clearly been written with a different pen. Laurie's attorneys also had some firearms experts examine the photographs of the bullet hole in Christine's back, and they concluded it was larger than the muzzle on Fred's off-duty revolver. The diameter of the revolver was 13.29 millimeters, while the diameter of the wound was 17.21 millimeters, meaning that Christine was likely shot with a weapon that was bigger than a .38. While the defense hoped to perform new ballistics testing, they learned that the bullet removed from Christine's body had been destroyed in a flood in 1986. Regardless, two of the experts agreed to write affidavits outlining the discrepancy with the gunshot wound, and one of them was renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz. By this point, Laurie felt that a strong alternate suspect in the crime was a career criminal named Frederick Hornberger, as both he and an accomplice named Daniel Gilbert had attacked and robbed Judy Zess at her apartment just over 1 month after Christine's murder, and the two crimes appeared to have a number of similarities. And like I just mentioned, Hornberg seemed to be well acquainted with Fred Schultz, as the two men had been seen together numerous times and worked on some remodeling and carpentry jobs together. After he received a 10-year prison sentence for the attack on Judy, Hornberger was eventually released, but on November 30th, 1991, both he and another accomplice named Thomas Eckert attempted to rob a Milwaukee bakery and found themselves being chased by the police. Hornberger forced his way into an elderly couple's home and held them at gunpoint, and a hostage situation ensued with the police, which lasted for several hours. During negotiations, Hornberg suddenly made a statement that he did not kill Christine Schultz, even though no one had even brought up her name until that point. Shortly thereafter, Hornberger walked down into the basement and took his own life after a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. After Hornberger's accomplice, Thomas Eckert, was taken into custody, he claimed that Hornberger had confessed to him on numerous occasions about having killed Christine Schultz. A number of inmates who had served time with Hornberger also signed sworn affidavits in which they alleged that he had bragged about murdering Christine after Fred paid him $10,000. Back in 1981, Hornberger lived only 7 blocks from Christine's residence, and he supposedly said that Fred provided him with a revolver and a copy of a key to enter the house. Laurie spent over a year at the Metro West Detention Center, and while she got to testify at the credible basis hearing, the proceedings kept getting interrupted and postponed. By the time 1992 rolled around, Laurie decided that she wanted to give up on her attempts to seek refugee status and instead be returned to Wisconsin. She felt this would allow her to participate in the investigation to find Christine's real killer and increase her chances of receiving a new trial and officially clearing her name. After her extradition order was signed, Laurie was transported to Wisconsin on April 20th, 1992, and returned to the Taycheedah Correctional Institution in Fond du Lac, though as punishment for her escape, she would be required to spend over a year in solitary confinement. After the John Doe investigation was completed, Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge William Hayes ruled that he did not believe the evidence presented was strong enough to support the allegations that there had been a deliberate conspiracy by Milwaukee law enforcement officials to frame Laurie. However, Laurie's defense team still argued that there were enough mistakes in the original investigation that she was entitled to receive a new trial. Well, Laurie was soon informed that rather than go to trial again, the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office was willing to offer her a deal in which she could enter a plea of no contest to the charge of second-degree murder. And in case you're not familiar with that term, a no contest plea is very similar to an Alford plea, as it allows a defendant to accept a conviction without admitting guilt. If Laurie agreed to enter this plea, she would receive a 20-year sentence, but it would be commuted to time served, allowing her to immediately walk out of prison. This would not exonerate Laurie, as she would technically remain a convicted murderer and receive an additional sentence of 10 years probation, but by this point, she had already spent nearly a decade behind bars and didn't want to run the risk of being convicted again at another trial. In the end, Laurie agreed to the deal, and after entering her no contest plea at a hearing which was held on December 9th, she was sentenced to time served and officially became a free woman. But of course, even though she was not considered to be factually innocent, Laurie continued to deny any involvement in Christine's murder. She made appearances on a number of TV shows and published a book about her story titled Woman on Trial. Prior to this, Milwaukee journalist Chris Radish had become one of Laurie's biggest supporters and published her own book about the case titled Run Bambi Run, which was a valuable resource when putting together these episodes. But it was clear that Laurie's incarceration had a profound negative effect on her, as she would deal with a number of personal issues following her release, which included struggles with alcoholism, health problems such as diabetes and hepatitis C, and being forced to file for bankruptcy. Laurie's criminal record made it very difficult for her to secure employment, though she did get hired as a mentor for an agency that provided assistance for poverty-stricken women. In February of 1996, Laurie was arrested on a marijuana possession charge, and after entering another plea of no contest, she received a $500 fine and a 15-day jail sentence, which counted as time served since she had already spent 15 days behind bars after she was first taken into custody. Appropriately enough, Laurie's defense attorney here was Dean Strang, who later found fame when he represented Stephen Avery after he was charged and convicted of the 2005 murder of Teresa Halbach. Of course, that's another Wisconsin case with allegations of the police framing someone for murder, so Strang was prominently featured in the Netflix true crime series Making a Murderer. Laurie's parents, Joe and Virginia Bembenek, had left Wisconsin in order to retire in Vancouver, Washington, so Laurie got permission to relocate there in order to be closer to them. But sadly, she wound up losing both of her parents within the span of just over 2 years, as Virginia died in November of 2000 at the age of 76, while Joe passed away in February of 2003 at age 83. In November of 2002, Laurie had agreed to make an appearance on the Dr. Phil show, as her attorneys were able to get an order for DNA testing on some of the evidence from the case, and the show was willing to pay for the brunt of the testing if Laurie would make an exclusive guest appearance on an episode in which the host, Dr. Phil McGraw, would reveal the results of the DNA testing to her on camera. Before the episode could be taped, Laurie was flown to Los Angeles, and Dr. Phil's handlers arranged to have her sequestered inside an apartment, as they said they wanted to protect her from any media harassment. But Laurie would later say that it felt like they were holding her against her will, and she started having flashbacks to her time spent in solitary confinement in prison. Laurie eventually suffered a panic attack and decided she could not handle being in the apartment anymore, so she tied some bedsheets together and attempted to escape by climbing out of a second-story window. Unfortunately, she wound up falling to the pavement and broke 2 bones and severed an artery in her right foot. The injury proved so severe that an infection developed, so her entire right leg had to be amputated below the knee. Laurie would later file a false imprisonment lawsuit against the Dr. Phil show over the whole situation, and they apparently reached a settlement. In spite of all her personal tragedies, Laurie did have one bright spot in her life when she began a relationship with a U.S. Forest Service ranger named Marty Carson, and the couple got married in June of 2005. By all accounts, Marty was a genuinely nice man, and since Laurie developed a new passion for painting during her time in prison, he decided to construct a studio for her. Laurie wound up using the space to create over 30 paintings, which were often put on display at a local art gallery, but she suffered another major setback when this gallery burned down and destroyed a lot of Laurie's artwork. This only worsened Laurie's struggles with alcoholism, as well as her mental health issues, and her marriage to Marty ended in divorce in 2007. In spite of this, Laurie and Marty remained close friends, and he continued to care for Laurie when her health declined. For years, Laurie attempted to overturn her murder conviction and have herself declared factually innocent, but the Wisconsin Supreme Court refused to hear her case, as they said that a no-contest plea could not be withdrawn. In April of 2008, Laurie's attorneys filed a petition with the United States Supreme Court and made note of numerous pieces of evidence which were withheld at her original trial. Even though her appearance on the Dr. Phil episode had fallen through, the planned DNA testing was eventually performed. The results showed no trace of Laurie's DNA anywhere at the murder scene, though 2 male DNA profiles were found on Christine Schultz. One of the profiles belonged to Christine's son Sean, who attended to her wound after she was shot, but the other DNA profile could not be identified. Following her death, a vaginal swab had been collected from Christine, and it showed the presence of male DNA containing a Y chromosome, suggesting that she may have been sexually assaulted by a man. However, since DNA profiling was not yet a tool in criminal investigations back in 1981, there was some question about how carefully this evidence was preserved, as it was argued that this DNA could have been the result of contamination and belonged to someone who handled the vaginal swab rather than the killer. The most disappointing result from the testing was that none of Frederick Hornberger's DNA was found on the evidence, so there was still nothing to conclusively link him to the crime. Laurie's attorneys also arranged for new ballistics testing to be performed by firing another test bullet from Fred's off-duty revolver, and it did not appear to match the bullet taken from Christine's body. Laurie's petition argued that the Supreme Court needed to clarify whether defendants who plead guilty or no contest have the same right to review evidence as defendants who plead not guilty, but the Supreme Court ultimately declined to hear her case. Unfortunately for Laurie, her health only worsened as her struggles with diabetes and hepatitis C caused her to develop serious liver and kidney problems. By 2010, her issues had gotten so bad that she had to be confined to a hospice facility in Portland, Oregon, and on November the 20th of that year, she passed away of liver failure at the age of 52. Following her death, her supporters petitioned the Wisconsin Pardon Advisory Board to offer Laurie a posthumous pardon for her crimes, but they refused to do so. In 2022, Campside Media released a new, long-form, multi-episode podcast about this story titled Run, Bambi, Run, hosted by journalist Vanessa Gregoriadis. While Laurie and many of the other key individuals associated with this case were deceased, two of the more controversial figures, Fred Schultz and Michael Durfee, were still alive at that point, but they declined to be interviewed or participate in the podcast. In the eyes of the law, Laurie Bambi Bembenek continues to remain a convicted murderer, but after 4 decades, there is still debate about who is actually responsible for killing Christine Schultz. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is the third case I've covered on The Trail Went Cold in 2025, which required multiple episodes, as you just couldn't adequately summarize the full saga of Christine Schultz and Laurie Bambi Bembenek in just 1 hour. For our podcast's recent 9-year anniversary show, I released a 3-part episode about the controversial conviction of Sam Shepard for the 1954 murder of his wife, Marilyn Reese Shepard, and one piece of misinformation which has often been spread about that case is that it was the inspiration for the hit TV series The Fugitives and the subsequent movie adaptation starring Harrison Ford. As you might know, The Fugitive chronicled the story of Dr. Richard Kimball, who was wrongly convicted of his wife's murder before he broke out of police custody and went on the run as a wanted fugitive in order to find the real killer and prove his innocence. Well, ironically enough, this story has a much closer resemblance to The Fugitive as, unlike Sam Shepard, Laurie Bembenek managed to orchestrate a prison escape and became one of the most infamous wanted fugitives in the history of the United States. Unlike Dr. Kimball, Laurie did not find the real killer or conclusively prove her innocence, as real life often doesn't work that way, and I'm sure in some people's eyes, breaking out of prison automatically made her look guilty. But even though Laurie's escape was technically a crime, it ultimately did pave the way to her finally getting out of prison for good. If Laurie had been recaptured before she fled the United States, the whole saga might have been quickly forgotten, but because she made it to Canada and practically turned the situation into an international incident, her case got more attention than it ever received before. Since the eyes of the world were now on them, it was clear that the state of Wisconsin had no desire to take Laurie to trial again, as I'm sure that Milwaukee law enforcement officials knew this had the potential to open up a major can of worms. This is why they ultimately agreed to offer Laurie a deal in which she pled no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for time served, because they likely just wanted the whole thing to go away. Laurie walked out of prison in December of 1992, but if she hadn't escaped, the earliest she would have been eligible for parole was 1993, and the chances of her receiving it if she did not admit guilt were pretty remote. So yes, Laurie's actions did help provide some short-term benefits for her, but the downside is that it made it nearly impossible for Laurie to achieve full exoneration. She also did not exactly live the happiest life after she became a free woman, and much like Sam Shepard, she struggled with alcoholism and developed a number of health issues before she died at a rather young age. Now, as someone who grew up in Ontario during the early 1990s, I remember this story being a huge deal and receiving a ton of media coverage after Laurie was discovered to be hiding out in Thunder Bay, and of course, a major legal battle ensued between Canada and the United States as Laurie attempted to seek refugee status. In May of 1992, only 1 month after Laurie agreed to be extradited back to Wisconsin, a made-for-TV movie was released about her story titled Calendar Girl Cop Killer, the Bambi Bembenek story, and Laurie reportedly hated it because they referred to her by her dreaded nickname in the title. 1 year later, in May of 1993, a more in-depth 2-part Canadian-produced made-for-TV movie was released titled Woman on the Run, the Laurencia Bembenek story, and since Laurie was a free woman by the time the movie aired, the story finally had an ending of sorts. This film starred Tatum O'Neal as Laurie, and one of our best Canadian character actors, Bruce Greenwood, as Fred Schultz, and I first watched the movie when it was screened during a media class I took while attending York University. I distinctly remember an unintentionally hilarious moment where the film showed a scene of Laurie and Fred bowling with Fred's 2 sons, and then did an abrupt cutaway to the next scene where Laurie and Fred were lying naked in bed together, and Laurie awkwardly delivered the line, quote, "I really like your boys." The problem was that Laurie appeared to be looking directly at Fred's crotch when she said this line, so I will never forget the entire class slowly breaking out into hysterical laughter as their dirty minds went into overdrive. Anyway, whenever I do a case about a controversial conviction in which there's ambiguity about the defendant's guilt or innocence, I like to remain as fair and objective as possible and research a number of different sources so that I can try and examine the viewpoints from both sides, which is exactly what I did during my series about the Shepherd case. During the intro to last week's episode, I made reference to Karen Reid's recent arrest for the murder of John O'Keefe, as I've seen comparisons get made between these two cases, since they both involve accusations of an innocent woman being framed by a corrupt police department. Since the Reid case is yet to reach a definitive conclusion, we still have no idea what actually happened there, but opinions are sharply divided, to say the least. You could say that about a lot of cases involving controversial convictions which have an ambiguous resolution, and if you search the internet, you'll usually find passionate pro-guilt and pro-innocence arguments from both sides. But I will say that even though Laurie Bembenek has never been officially exonerated, it does seem like opinions about her case seem to be overwhelmingly pro-innocence. Yes, Milwaukee law enforcement officials have always maintained that she is guilty, but I have not found any books, podcasts, or websites out there that have outlined a convincing argument that Laurie was responsible for killing Christine Schultz, and there doesn't seem to be any particularly damning evidence against her that has been left out of the pro-innocence narratives. Of course, the other famous case from Wisconsin involving allegations of a police frame-up job is Stephen Avery's conviction for the murder of Teresa Halbach, but making a murderer has faced criticism for distorting the facts to present this narrative, and there are plenty of other media outlets out there which have presented pro-guilt arguments for Avery. However, that is not the case with Laurie Bembenek, as many of the allegations about planted and fabricated evidence really do not seem all that implausible. The fact of the matter is that the Milwaukee Police Department was just rampant with corruption and misogyny during the 1980s, and Laurie had become a major thorn in their side by filing a discrimination claim against them, so if they wanted to pin a murder on someone, I'm sure she would have made an ideal scapegoat. Given the circumstances, it is pretty surprising that Laurie even began a relationship with Fred Schultz to begin with and agreed to marry him so quickly, because he seemed to be a guy who represented everything that she hated, but I'm guessing that he must have come across as really charming on the surface. I can't help but think that Fred may have had sinister motives when he asked Laurie to accompany him to Illinois to get married, as Wisconsin law at the time stipulated that a person had to be divorced for at least 6 months before they could get remarried. I'm not sure if Fred was aware of this law and traveled to Illinois to subvert it, but I have to wonder if he wanted to get married to Laurie as quickly as possible for the purposes of invoking spousal privilege in case Laurie was ever called upon to testify against him for his transgressions. That's not to say that Fred was already planning the murder of his ex-wife, but he definitely had skeletons in his closet. Since Laurie was a strong feminist who seemed to have no qualms about standing up for women's rights, even at great risk to herself, it is hard to reconcile someone like that being callous enough to murder a woman in her own home while her children are there. While I don't think Laurie and Christine would have been on each other's Christmas card lists, it's not like they ever got into any heated arguments or violent altercations, as they were able to remain cordial enough whenever they crossed paths. At trial, the prosecution tried to paint Laurie as a gold digger who felt entitled to an upper-class lifestyle, but became angry over the fact that Fred's divorce from Christine had put them under considerable financial strain since he was now responsible for alimony, child support payments, and mortgage payments. But one of the holes in that logic is that after Christine was killed, Fred had to take on the responsibility of looking after his two sons, Sean and Shannon, for a while, which was only going to be a greater financial burden. Laurie was always very upfront about the fact that she had no desire to ever have children, and while I'm sure she felt terrible about these two boys losing their mother, she also grew frustrated over the fact that she now had to assume the role of de facto stepmother and take care of Sean and Shannon, which was not something she ever asked for. I find it very odd that Laurie was charged with first-degree murder, yet when she went to trial, the prosecution presented a scenario where Laurie was hoping to frighten Christine out of her house so that she and Fred could move in there together. Laurie's alleged plan was to stage a home invasion robbery in hopes that it would make Christine think the neighborhood was unsafe and compel her to leave, but then something went horribly wrong, and Laurie's gun accidentally went off and killed Christine. I mean, if that scenario was true, I don't think the crime would quite fit the definition of first-degree murder, so this gives me the impression that the prosecution was having a difficult time fashioning a logical scenario which implicated Laurie, so they were throwing what they could at the wall to see what stuck. The theory really doesn't make much sense, and Laurie always maintained that she had no interest in ever living in that house, as Fred was the one who had an obsession with it since he had built the house from scratch and felt entitled to it. The case against Laurie is filled with weird contradictions, as she is sometimes painted as a diabolical criminal mastermind, yet at the same time, she was accused of making some mind-boggling mistakes which even the stupidest criminal would be unlikely to make. To explain away Laurie's fingerprints not being found at the scene, the prosecution alleged that as a former police officer, she would have been wise enough to wear gloves. Fair enough, but as a former police officer, she also presumably would have understood how ballistics tests work and known that it would be a terrible idea to steal your husband's gun to commit a crime and, rather than get rid of it, return the murder weapon to the same drawer where it was kept in their apartment. And while I can understand the idea of Laurie wearing a wig in order to disguise herself, would she really be dumb enough to get rid of it by flushing it down her own toilet? The whole situation seems even more ridiculous when you consider that the prosecution brought in a witness who claimed to have seen Laurie's mother, Virginia, removing a garbage bag from her apartment complex's dumpster, which supposedly contained key evidence, such as the jogging suit Laurie wore when she committed the crime. So basically, Laurie was adept enough to ensure the jogging suit was never found, yet attempted to flush the wig down the toilet and kept the gun at her apartment. The two judges from Laurie's preliminary hearing and her trial both referred to the case against her as the most circumstantial case they had ever seen, but the one piece of evidence they just could not overlook was the fact that Fred's off-duty .38 caliber revolver appeared to be the murder weapon, and Laurie would have been the only one who had access to it during the time period the crime took place. But as the years went on, it becomes more and more apparent that some shady stuff may have taken place behind the scenes, and this revolver was not actually the murder weapon after all. And once you take that away, the case against Laurie does not really hold up, and is based on a lot of unconfirmed speculation and hearsay. Technically, it would not have been impossible for Laurie to commit the crime, though the whole thing would need to take place during a window of just over 2 hours. We know that Fred phoned Laurie at the apartment from the police station at around 12:30 a.m. that night, and then phoned her again at 2:42 a.m. to inform her about Christine's murder. Christine's house was located 2 miles from the apartment, but Fred's partner, Michael Durfee, felt the engine of Laurie's car later that morning and confirmed it was still cold, so putting aside the unlikely possibility of someone else giving Laurie a ride to the Schultz residence, she would have needed to travel there and back on foot. Given that Laurie was an avid jogger, I'm sure she could have pulled it off, but it does not sound like any eyewitnesses reported seeing her during that time frame. We did have one sighting of what appeared to be a man in a green jogging suit with reddish-brown hair standing in the bushes outside a nearby nursing home, but this took place at 2:50 a.m., shortly after Laurie answered the phone call from Fred at her apartment, so the person in the bushes definitely couldn't have been her. Laurie's alibi for this 2-hour window is that she was sleeping alone at the apartment, and while this obviously couldn't be verified, there's not much she can really do to change that if it's the truth. But what's interesting is that Judy had originally been hoping to go out with a female friend of hers that night until plans fell through, but if they had gotten together, this friend may have been able to vouch for Laurie's whereabouts, and this case would have turned out much differently. According to Laurie, after Fred first left the apartment to go work his shift, he phoned her quite a few times, and she said he ordinarily did not call that often while he was on duty. It was not until Fred's 12:30 a.m. phone call from the police station when Laurie officially confirmed to him that she was not getting together with her friend and was planning to go to bed, and she didn't hear from him again until after Christine's death. If you believe Fred was involved in the murder and was planning to pin it on Laurie, this may have been a calculated attempt on his part to ensure that Christine was killed during a time frame when Laurie would not have a verifiable alibi. Obviously, it's incredibly shady that in the hours following the murder, Fred and Michael Durfee stopped by the apartment to collect Fred's off-duty revolver and confirmed it had not been recently fired, yet weeks later, it somehow turned out to be the murder weapon. Since the gun used to shoot Christine was pressed directly against her skin, experts agreed that it likely would have gotten blood or tissue on it due to the blowback, but none was found. Yes, this could have been because Laurie cleaned the gun after she brought it home, but the big issue is that Durfee found traces of dust on it, which seemed to indicate that the gun had not even been touched in a long time. Now, the only witnesses who were present when the gun was examined were Laurie, Fred, and Durfee, so we technically only have their word that these events unfolded that way. But we also don't have a proper chain of custody for this weapon, since the serial number was never recorded, and Durfee inexplicably lost the logbook he had been carrying on his shift that night, even though collecting and preserving potential evidence from the murder of your partner's ex-wife should be a pretty big deal. And when Durfee testified at trial, he claimed that after he examined the gun, Fred and Laurie walked off and had a private conversation together, which suggested possible collusion, but Laurie denied that this conversation ever took place, and Durfee never mentioned it in any of his previous statements. Fred also claimed that he turned the gun over to his superiors during a meeting at the police administration building that morning, yet no documentation was ever found to confirm that this meeting ever took place, so we really don't know who had possession of this revolver during the 3-week window before the ballistics tests supposedly matched it to the bullet from Christine's body. From what I've heard, if someone with a personal connection to a police officer is murdered, the department will usually prevent that officer from actively participating in the investigation to avoid any possible conflict of interest issues. But here, the ex-wife of a police officer is shot to death, and not only is he collecting and handling potential evidence without any oversight, he's also heavily involved with the processing of the crime scene, as he supposedly ordered some of the officers to prepare Christine's body to be removed from the scene before the medical examiner arrived, even though this was not proper procedure. I know that years later, numerous experts would look at the photos of Christine's bullet wound and conclude that it was too large to have been caused by Fred's off-duty revolver, and this does make sense because when police first saw the wound, they initially assumed that it was made by a .45 caliber weapon until the ballistics test supposedly confirmed it was a .38. It's also troubling that small traces of blood were found on the barrel of the duty revolver that Fred had been carrying on his shift on the night the murder took place. This particular revolver had a 4-inch barrel, whereas the off-duty revolver had a 2-inch barrel, so if tests had been performed on this gun, I'd be curious to know if it would have been a closer match to the bullet wound. You might think this sounds like too much of a conspiracy theory, but I think the evidence clearly shows that the off-duty revolver could not have been used during the crime, and some shady stuff must have taken place in order to create this false narrative. So once you discount the idea that Laurie had access to the murder weapon, how much real evidence is there against her? Well, we know that Fred made a copy of his son's key to Christine's residence, and if the killer used it to let themselves inside, that would explain the lack of forced entry. But Laurie always maintained that she never even knew this spare key existed until after she saw Fred searching for it following the murder. And unlike the revolver, we can't be certain that Laurie had access to this key during the time period Christine was killed. Well, Judy Zest testified that Laurie owned many of the items used by the killer during the commission of the crime, such as the green jogging suit, the blue bandana, and the clothesline. This was never conclusively proven. And I don't put much stock into the eyewitness testimony from Marilyn Gert and Annette Wilson, who suddenly popped up at the very last minute at the trial to share unbelievable and uncorroborated stories about Laurie having purchased a wig and stolen a green jogging suit. It also bothers me that this jogging suit was treated as such a big deal, since Sean Schultz had described the intruder as wearing a green khaki army jacket. His brother Shannon said that it was a green jogging suit with yellow stripes, but it's unclear why the police and the media ultimately decided to go with this narrative. Laurie and her parents claimed that shortly after the crime took place, they were watching a news broadcast about it alongside the two boys, and when the jogging suit was mentioned, Sean openly questioned why they were reporting this, since he was still certain that the killer wore a green army jacket. Since Shannon was only 7 years old and Sean was 11 and got a much better look at the perpetrator, who directly attacked him, you would think that the police might put more stock into Sean's account, but apparently not, as I do not believe the public heard any media coverage which mentioned an army jacket. We know that a blonde hair which was consistent with Laurie's hair was found on Christine's gag, though if this case took place today, I'm sure DNA testing would have conclusively determined if the hair actually belonged to her. However, the assistant medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Samuels, always maintained that there were no blonde hairs on any of the evidence when she performed the autopsy. The only hairs that Dr. Samuels collected were brown and likely belonged to Christine, and Samuels claimed that she put them in a sealed envelope and sent them to the police. Dr. Samuels has since passed away, but she always came across as a very credible and well-respected individual, so assuming that she isn't misremembering things, her account strongly suggests that after one of Laurie's blonde hairs was collected as evidence from her hairbrush, it was somehow mixed in with the evidence from the crime scene. Getting back to Judy Zest, she is undoubtedly one of the most controversial figures in this whole saga, as even though they had once been close friends, Judy testified about Laurie having made some incriminating remarks about wanting Christine dead. I find it particularly troubling that Laurie supposedly made some of these remarks to Judy's boyfriend, Tom Gertner, who was in prison at the time, so he was never called upon to testify and share the story himself, so I don't see why Judy's testimony wasn't considered to be hearsay. Laurie always insisted that Judy's claims were untrue, and Judy later recanted her testimony, but since she passed away in 2018, we may never know where she ultimately stood on this whole issue. Since Tom Gertner was arrested on drug charges during the same time period as Christine's murder, it's been inferred that Judy agreed to provide false testimony against Laurie in exchange for Tom's sentence being reduced. But while perjury is one thing, flushing a wig down a toilet in an apparent attempt to plant evidence to frame your best friend is on an entirely different level. However, since Sharon Neiswanger confirmed that Judy had asked to use her bathroom right before she discovered that her toilet was clogged, and a wig was soon found in her drain pipes, Judy using that opportunity to flush the wig makes a lot more sense than Laurie being stupid enough to flush the wig herself. While this particular wig contained synthetic fibers, which were consistent with the fibers found on Christine's body, we can't even be certain it was the same one used during the commission of the crime. We know that a few weeks after the wig was found, Judy wound up being attacked and robbed inside her apartment by Frederick Hornberger, who was wearing a reddish-brown wig just like that one. That definitely seems like way too much of a coincidence, so if you believe that Hornberger was Christine's killer, perhaps he was wearing the same wig during both crimes, and the wig found in the drain pipes is a totally different one. Regardless, I somehow doubt that Hornberger and his accomplice, Daniel Gilbert, targeted Judy completely at random. It's been suspected that the two men were looking for some drugs that Tom Gertner had stashed at the apartment, as Tom was already behind bars at that point. But since the crime took place a few weeks after Laurie's arrest and before her preliminary hearing took place, I also wonder if it might have been intended as some sort of message in order to convince Judy to play ball and help get Laurie convicted. In my eyes, the biggest piece of evidence supporting Laurie's innocence is the fact that Sean Schultz testified that he was 100% certain that the intruder who killed his mother was not Laurie, as he believed it was a man. Given that Milwaukee law enforcement officials seemed anxious to nail Laurie, I would not be surprised if Sean faced considerable pressure to change his story and identify her from the witness stand, but he never wavered from his original account, which is quite remarkable given that he was only 11 at the time. Now, even survivors of violent crime are not infallible when it comes to eyewitness identification, as we've seen numerous documented cases of innocent people being wrongly convicted of rape when their victim positively identified them as the attacker. Anyone who experiences a traumatic ordeal like this is capable of misremembering details, but even so, I'd like to think that while the murderer was masked, Sean would have still been able to tell if they were a man or a woman, as he described this person as a heavy-set male who had a different body type than Laurie. Sean had also spent quite a bit of time with Laurie when his father had visitations with him, so it's not like she was a complete stranger. Sean and his brother Shannon pretty much disappeared from the spotlight after the conclusion of Laurie's trial, and as far as I can tell, they were both raised by Christine's side of the family, and I'm unsure if Fred continued to play much of a role in their lives. I definitely feel nothing but sympathy for them, as it must have been a traumatic ordeal to lose their mother and witness her murder become a media circus which remained in the spotlight for over a decade. And I'm sure it wasn't easy to hear rumors about their father possibly being involved in the crime. I hope Sean and Shannon had a smooth transition into adulthood and are doing well, but I'd really be curious to hear their thoughts about the case today, and I wonder if Sean has still never wavered from his belief that Laurie was not the killer. We know that Sean was woken up in the middle of the night when the intruder wrapped something around his neck, but the attack was interrupted when Shannon woke up and kicked at this person. I'm not sure if the killer had any intention of harming the children or was just planning to tie them up, but I know that a convict would later allege that Fred was the mastermind behind this crime and hired a hitman to kill his wife, but he also ordered this person to wake up his sons so they could get a good look at them and tell the police that the intruder was not Fred. Indeed, even though the perpetrator was masked, I still think there's a good chance the two boys would have been able to tell if it was their own father. Of course, since this allegation was made by a convicted criminal, you have to take it with a huge grain of salt, but if he is telling the truth, then it's pretty twisted that Fred would intentionally arrange for his children to experience such a traumatic event. We'll talk more about this angle later on, but an alternate explanation is that the intruder may have wanted to tie the kids up because they were planning to search the house for something, but after the kids fought back, he was forced to shoot Christine and flee the scene. Well, it seems likely that the intruder bound and gagged Christine before he went into the children's bedroom. The boys did not hear the gunshot until after they woke up, so the perpetrator may have originally planned to be inside the house for a prolonged period of time. I mentioned earlier that less than an hour after the crime took place, a man in a green jogging suit and reddish-brown hair was seen in the bushes outside a nursing home located less than a mile away, though it was never conclusively established if this person was the killer. One odd aspect of this case which doesn't get discussed all that much is how a neighbor of Christine's named Ray Kojawa claimed that on the night of the murder, while he was out staying with a friend, someone broke into his garage and stole a green jogging suit and a .38 caliber revolver. If Kojawa is telling the truth, then this sounds like too much of a coincidence, but Kojawa also refused to testify at Laurie's preliminary hearing, and he reportedly had the same body type as the intruder. There's not much information out there about Kojawa, so I have no idea what motive he would have had to commit a crime like this. But I can also understand why the state elected to downplay his story, because their whole case against Laurie was based on the idea that she already had the jogging suit and the revolver in her possession and wouldn't have needed to steal these items from some random neighbor's garage. So what are we to make of Fred Schultz? Well, even without the murder of his ex-wife, Fred was still a very problematic person, and in our last episode, I discussed a controversial incident where he was responsible for shooting an off-duty cop from another department, though he was ultimately cleared by the internal affairs investigation. And it's also been alleged that his own department was looking to file charges against him for some other offenses, but the Milwaukee County District Attorney declined to do so because they feared it would provide an unnecessary distraction from Laurie's trial. If Fred was involved in Christine's murder and wanted Larry to take the fall for it, then he certainly played the long game, as he publicly offered non-stop support for Laurie throughout her arrest and her trial, though it didn't take long for him to break things off with her after she was sent to prison. But at the same time, you also saw him sharing potentially untrue bits of information with the authorities, which proved damaging to Laurie, such as his claim that he had seen Laurie playing with the bullets inside the pouch next to his off-duty revolver, which she always denied. One of the biggest issues with Laurie's trial is that Fred was heavily involved with working alongside her defense attorney, Donald Eisenberg, and paid many of his legal bills, and if this caused Eisenberg to shy away from exploring evidence or scenarios which pointed towards Fred as an alternate suspect, then this could have created a major conflict of interest. To be fair to Eisenberg, it sounds like at that point, Laurie herself wasn't willing to acknowledge the possibility that Fred was involved, as she asked Eisenberg not to present the aforementioned statement from the convict about Fred hiring a hitman. But given the problematic nature of the state's case, it seems clear that Eisenberg did not mount as effective a defense as he should have. And while Fred did put up the facade of being the supportive husband, it's disturbing to think that he may have had a vested interest in Laurie being found guilty and used his influence to undermine her defense. I don't think it's likely that Fred committed the murder himself because, again, even if he was wearing a mask, I have a feeling that his own sons would have been able to tell if he was the intruder. In addition, this person was described as being heavyset, whereas Fred was more muscular and in better shape. However, it is very troubling that Fred and Michael Durfee seemed to lie about their alibi that night, as they claimed they were on duty investigating a burglary, even though numerous witnesses saw them drinking at various bars together. All that being said, even if this was not the original alibi they shared with investigators, they technically still did have an alibi, placing them in these bars at the time of Christine's murder, so even if Fred had no involvement, I could see him lying about his whereabouts in order to avoid admitting that he was drinking on duty. Even though Fred claimed that he never left Durfee's side all night, George Marks, the owner of one of the pubs where the two men were drinking, said that Fred just seemed to disappear for a period of time at around 2 a.m. It's never been specified how long Fred was out of sight, and while I have my doubts that it would have been long enough for him to travel to Christine's home and commit the murder before he returned to the bar, he could have conceivably been using that time to make a phone call or meet up with someone who was connected to the crime. After all, Frederick Hornberger supposedly claimed that Fred provided him with a murder weapon and a key to the house, so perhaps this took place during that window of time when Fred's whereabouts could not be verified. Unlike many of the other key figures in the story, Fred is still alive today, but he has not done any interviews or publicly talked about this case in decades. He did not participate in the aforementioned Run Bambi Run podcast, and it also featured a moment where the host, Vanessa Gregoriadis, attempted to phone Michael Durfee and ask him about the case until he said he didn't want to talk about it and abruptly hung up. I have no idea what Durfee may or may not have known about Christine's murder, but if Fred was involved, it seems likely that Durfee would have needed to help cover for him, or at the very least, he knows more than he's letting on. But now we need to talk about Frederick Hornberger, as some people suspect that he was the mysterious masked intruder and Christine's real killer. There's also been speculation that multiple people could have been in the house that night, though Sean and Shannon only reported seeing one person running away from their mother's bedroom. I guess it's still possible that an additional individual was involved in this crime, but they remained downstairs the entire time and were out of the children's sight. I know that when Hornberger attacked and robbed Judy Zess a month and a half later, he did so alongside an accomplice named Daniel L. Gilbert, and a Danny L. Gilbert was questioned by police on the night of the murder while parked on a freeway overpass located behind Christine's house. While it was never conclusively established that these two men were the same person, that does seem like a striking coincidence, and a case which has quite a few major coincidences. So if Hornberg was the killer, perhaps Gilbert waited outside and functioned as his getaway driver. We do know that Hornberger received a 10-year prison sentence for his attack on Judy, but what's interesting is that before Laurie's trial took place, he seemingly made an attempt to undermine Judy's credibility by sharing information with Donald Eisenberg to suggest that Judy was working with the Milwaukee PD to conspire against Laurie, as Judy wanted to help her own boyfriend's legal situation. Hell, he also claimed that Judy was sleeping with Frank Cole, one of the detectives on Laurie's case, but Hornberger was a convicted criminal, and since his statements were considered to be hearsay, the judge would not allow Hornberger to testify at Laurie's trial. While I could see Hornberger volunteering information in an attempt to help his own legal situation, it seems odd that he would do this if he was involved in Christine's murder, since I'm sure he had a vested interest in Laurie taking the fall for his crime. After all, even though he was facing 10 years for armed robbery, his sentence would be a lot worse if he was implicated in a murder. Over the years, Hornberger allegedly bragged to numerous people about having killed Christine, and of course, after being released from prison, he committed another robbery and found himself in a hostage situation where he decided to take his own life rather than be recaptured. But while this was going on, Hornberger went out of his way to make a statement that he had nothing to do with Christine Schultz's murder, even though police never even mentioned the crime to him. At that point, Laurie was still being held in a Canadian detention center, and her story was all over the media since the case was being reinvestigated, so Hornberg may have grown paranoid that things would eventually catch up to him, and this played a major role in influencing his suicide. It's been established that Fred did have an existing relationship with Hornberger prior to Christine's murder, so if Fred needed to hire someone to commit murder on his behalf, this guy would have been a logical candidate. But if that's what happened, the big question is, did Fred simply want his ex-wife out of the picture to be free of his obligations to her? Or was there more to this story? Well, I mentioned in our last episode that in December of 1982, Milwaukee police officer Stu Honick, who was Christine's boyfriend at the time of her death, made an odd phone call to Laurie's parents in which he alleged that $300,000 worth of drugs may have been stolen from her residence on the night she was killed. He also seemed to have a particular interest in what happened to Christine's plants, since they would have been an ideal place to hide narcotics from drug-sniffing dogs. Right after Christine's murder, Fred made some remarks to Laurie in which he expressed suspicion that Stu may have been responsible for the crime. It sounds like Stu was not exactly a choir boy himself, as he had a drinking problem at that time, but I haven't heard anything about him mistreating Christine, and I don't believe he was ever considered to be a serious suspect in her murder. It's no big secret that Fred and Stu despised each other, and it's possible that finding out that his ex-wife was dating another cop, who also happened to be his former roommate, may have been Fred's breaking point. But I'm really not sure what gave Stu the idea that Christine was hiding drugs in her house, and why did he suddenly decide to tell Laurie's parents about this nearly a year after she went to prison? Given Fred's shady history, I would not be the least bit surprised if he may have been involved in drugs during his time on the police force, but I kind of doubt he would be hiding his stash at his ex-wife's house several months after they finalized a contentious divorce. Unless, of course, Fred originally hid something there before the divorce took place, and he was unable to retrieve it, since he was forbidden from setting foot on the premises without Christine's permission. I really can't overlook the similarities between this crime and Hornberger and Gilbert's attack on Judy's S, as they both involved an assailant who wore a reddish-brown wig and used a .38 caliber revolver and bound and gagged their victim. Hornberger and Gilbert stole some money and stereo equipment from Judy's apartment, though the main reason they may have wanted to rob the place was because they believed Tom Gertner had a stash of drugs there. While nothing appeared to have been stolen from Christine's residence and the place wasn't ransacked, Fred did point out that a stereo and a strongbox in the den appeared to have been moved, as if an intruder had been searching for something. If Christine's killer was searching for drugs, perhaps they decided to bind and gag her and were planning to do the same thing to her kids while they performed a more thorough search of the residence. But when Sean and Shannon fought back, they realized this whole strategy had backfired, so they killed Christine and immediately fled the scene without getting the opportunity to find what they were looking for. It also appeared that some pictures may have been removed from a photo album Christine was keeping in her house, and since their fingerprints were on them, the album was probably handled by Fred and the lead investigator, Carl Russiti. This album contains some of the controversial photos of Fred and other cops dancing naked at the police picnic in 1980, but Laurie had already delivered copies of these photos to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission by that point. I don't think those photos alone would have been scandalous enough to drive someone to murder, but I do wonder what else may have been inside the album which would compel the police or possibly even the killer to remove them. It's been reported that the Trax Tavern, which held the picnic where this new dancing took place, was a very popular cop hangout at the time. It was always rumored to be a haven for illegal activity involving the police, such as drug dealing, but I don't know, I'm inclined to think this drug angle is nothing more than a red herring. Even though there was undoubtedly a lot of shady stuff going on in the Milwaukee PD at that time, I'm not sure it would have led to the murder of a police officer's ex-wife. No, I'm inclined to believe this crime was a lot more personal, and of course, who would have had a stronger motive to want Christine dead than Fred? Even though she had gotten married to Fred, I just don't see Laurie having a motive to commit this crime, and nothing in her background seemed to suggest that she was capable of something like this. Now, when a vaginal swab was taken from Christine, it turned up what appeared to be the presence of male DNA with a Y chromosome, which could indicate that the killer sexually assaulted or attempted to sexually assault Christine, and this would definitely point away from Laurie being the guilty party. But this whole situation takes me back to my recent series about the murder of Marilyn Reese Shepherd, as some sperm samples and other DNA evidence was tested decades after the murder took place. However, since the crime occurred long before DNA profiling was used as a tool in criminal investigations, evidence collection was not handled as carefully back then, so there was always the possibility of contamination taking place and affecting the results of future DNA testing. We also know that Stu Honig was at the residence that night and left at around 11 p.m., but I haven't heard anything about him having consensual sex with Christine while he was there. Traces of a fluid which could have been semen were found during the autopsy, though they couldn't determine for certain, but theoretically, if Christine had consensual sex with someone like Stu a day or two before she was killed, perhaps that could account for the small remnants of male DNA. The modern testing did not find any traces of DNA at the murder scene which belonged to Laurie or Frederick Hornberger, but that doesn't necessarily prove they didn't do it. I do think that if I had to pick someone who would be the most likely candidate to be the killer, it would be Hornberger, but since he has been deceased for over 30 years, and his DNA does not appear to be present anywhere, how can we conclusively prove his involvement after all this time? Yes, he supposedly confessed to the murder to numerous people over the years prior to his death, but it sounds like all the people who allege this are criminals, so can we really trust their accounts? The issue is that since this whole saga ended with Laurie entering a no-contest plea, the case is technically considered to be closed in the eyes of law enforcement. I'm sure that anyone who was in power in Wisconsin back in the early 1990s had no desire to perform a new investigation given the potential scandal that could have unraveled. Sometimes, we only get a conclusive resolution in these cold cases when the old guard are no longer in power and fresh blood wants to take a new look at everything. So will there ever be anyone who comes to power in the state of Wisconsin in the near future who would be willing to shake things up and correct a potential injustice? I can't say for certain if Fred Schultz himself was directly complicit in his ex-wife's death, but you cannot deny that there was a lot of suspicious behavior from the Milwaukee PD, and they may have tried to railroad Laurie in a huge way. I've tried to keep an open mind and look at both sides in this case, but I just can't find anything that compels me to believe that Laurie was the person who committed this crime, and it's just a tragedy that the whole thing ruined her life, and she died without getting her name cleared. Unfortunately, in most cases involving controversial convictions, the victim is often not remembered as much as the defendant who was accused of killing them, and while the name Laurie Bembenek is well known in true crime circles, the name Christine Schultz is often forgotten. Being murdered in your own bed while your children are in the house is a pretty horrible fate, and it's a major shame that Christine pretty much got overshadowed by Laurie Bembenek's dramatic story, and her killer never got to face justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Christine Schultz, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a triple homicide known as the Leathers Oil Company murders, which took place back in 1994, but even though 2 of the individuals involved in the crime were caught and convicted, the alleged mastermind, Tyrone Thies, has never been found and has remained a wanted fugitive for the past 3 decades. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1930 disappearance of an abducted 2-year-old infant named Mary Agnes Maroney. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Beth, Alfonsina S., Okala E., JW, and Suzanne T. Thank you all so much for your support. Also, I wanted to announce that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get 20% off. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20 for 20% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.